The morning light filtered through Helen's kitchen window as she reached for her favorite coffee mug, the one her daughter had given her last Christmas with "World's Best Grandma" painted in cheerful blue letters. At 67, Helen had built a life of quiet independence in her cozy home, surrounded by decades of memories and the comforting rhythm of routines she'd perfected over the years. She took pride in her independent living, having learned that life after 60 could be filled with unexpected joys and newfound freedoms. But this Tuesday morning would challenge everything she thought she knew about senior empowerment and self-reliance. As Helen lifted the mug to her lips, something felt wrong. The porcelain slipped from her fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor in a cascade of ceramic pieces that seemed to echo through the silent house. For a moment, she stared at the mess, confused. Her left hand felt strange, almost disconnected from her body. A tingling sensation crept up her arm, and when she tried to speak, to call out for help, perhaps, the words came out slurred and unfamiliar. Helen's mind, sharp from years of navigating life's challenges with emotional wisdom, immediately recognized the signs she'd read about in her health magazines. The drooping sensation on one side of her face, the sudden weakness in her arm, the difficulty forming words clearly. These weren't symptoms to ignore or brush off as simply getting older. This was a stroke, and she was completely alone. The nearest neighbor was Mrs. Patterson, but she was away visiting her son in another state. Helen's daughter lived 3 hours away, and her son was traveling for work. The landline sat across the kitchen, seeming impossibly far away as her left leg began to feel unsteady. Her smartphone lay charging in the bedroom upstairs, a journey that now felt like climbing Mount Everest. In that moment of crisis, Helen drew upon the emotional strength she'd cultivated through decades of facing life's ups and downs. She remembered her grandmother's words, "When life knocks you down, you don't stay down. You think, you act, you survive." This wasn't just about medical emergency protocols or calling 911, though those were crucial. This was about the deeper wisdom that comes with age, the knowledge that survival sometimes depends on the split-second decisions we make when everything seems to be falling apart. Helen's story represents something many of us fear but rarely discuss openly: facing a medical emergency alone, especially as we age. The reality is that millions of seniors live independently. And while this independence brings tremendous joy and fulfillment, it also means we must be prepared for moments when our bodies betray us and help isn't immediately available. What Helen did next would determine whether she'd become another tragic statistic or a powerful example of how preparation, quick thinking, and the quiet courage that comes with life experience can mean the difference between life and death. The action she took in those first critical minutes would either save her life or leave her family wondering if they could have done something differently. As Helen stood in her kitchen, surrounded by broken ceramic and facing the most dangerous moment of her life, she made a choice that would change everything. But the question remains, do you know what she did? Do you know what you would do? The clock on her wall ticked steadily, each second more precious than the last. Hashtag Chapter 2, The Weight of Solitude. Helen had always prided herself on being prepared. It was a trait she developed during her 35 years as a school librarian, where anticipating students' needs and planning for every possible scenario had become second nature. But life after retirement had brought unexpected challenges that no amount of preparation could have fully addressed. When her husband Robert passed away 4 years ago, Helen discovered that finding purpose after decades of shared routines required a different kind of strength. The house that had once buzzed with conversation and laughter now held only the sounds of her own footsteps and the hum of appliances. Friends had worried about her living alone, but Helen had insisted on maintaining her independence. "I'm not ready for assisted living," she told her daughter during one of their weekly phone calls. "I still have so much life left to live." And she did. Helen had thrown herself into senior reflection and personal growth with the same determination she'd once applied to organizing library events. She'd joined a book club, started volunteering at the local food bank, and even taken up watercolor painting, something she'd always wanted to try but never had time for during her working years. These activities had given her a sense of emotional resilience and community connection that helped fill the void left by Robert's absence. But the quiet moments still caught her off guard. Like this morning, when she'd been thinking about the conversation she'd had with her neighbor's granddaughter the week before. The young woman had been struggling with college applications, and Helen had found herself sharing advice about perseverance and believing in yourself. "You remind me of my favorite teacher," the girl had said, and Helen had felt a familiar warmth, the satisfaction of knowing she still had something valuable to offer. Now, as the stroke's symptoms intensified, Helen's mind drifted to the promises she'd made to herself and others. She committed to helping with the library's summer reading program. Her garden needed tending, and she'd promised to share vegetables with the young family next door. Most importantly, she had plans to visit her son's family next month. Her granddaughter's first piano recital was something she absolutely couldn't miss. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd spent years learning to be comfortable with solitude, only to face a moment when being alone felt like her greatest vulnerability. She thought about the emergency preparedness class she'd attended at the community center 6 months ago. The instructor had emphasized the importance of having a plan, but Helen realized now that knowing what to do and actually doing it under extreme stress were entirely different challenges. Her reflection was interrupted by another wave of symptoms. The left side of her face felt increasingly numb, and her speech difficulties were becoming more pronounced. She'd read enough about strokes to know that every minute mattered, that the window for effective treatment was narrow and getting smaller with each passing moment. Helen's thoughts turned to her grandmother, who had lived through the Great Depression and always spoke about the importance of staying calm in crisis. "Panic is a luxury we can't afford," she used to say. "When trouble comes, you breathe, you think, you act." This wisdom had served Helen well through various life challenges, from raising 2 children largely on her own when Robert worked long hours, to navigating the complexities of caring for aging parents. The question now was whether a lifetime of problem-solving and emotional resilience would be enough to get her through the next few critical minutes. The phone seemed both impossibly far away and urgently necessary, but Helen knew that simply reaching it wouldn't be enough. She needed a strategy, and she needed it now. As she stood there, fighting against her body's betrayal, Helen made a decision that would draw upon every lesson she'd learned about survival, preparation, and the quiet courage that comes with age. Hashtag Chapter 3, Lessons from a Lifetime. The trembling in Helen's left hand brought back memories of her mother's final years, when Parkinson's disease had slowly stolen her independence. Helen had been the primary caregiver then, juggling her full-time job with endless medical appointments and the gradual acceptance that roles between parent and child were reversing. Those years had taught her about the fragility of the human body and the importance of advocating for yourself when medical emergencies strike. "Never assume someone else will take care of you," her mother had whispered during one of their last conversations. "You have to be your own best advocate, especially when you're older." At the time, Helen had nodded politely, thinking it was just another piece of well-meaning advice. Now, standing in her kitchen with stroke symptoms worsening, those words carried the weight of prophecy. Helen's journey through senior reflection had revealed patterns she'd never noticed before. She realized that throughout her life, she'd been the one others turned to in crisis. Where her sister's marriage fell apart, Helen had provided both emotional support and practical solutions. When her elderly neighbor had broken her hip, Helen had coordinated meal deliveries and medical appointments. When her daughter struggled with postpartum depression, Helen had moved in for 3 months to help with the grandchildren. But who would step up for her now? The question had haunted her during the early months of widowhood, when she discovered that finding purpose after decades of caring for others required redefining her entire identity. Life after retirement had forced her to confront the uncomfortable truth that she'd spent so much time being useful to others that she'd forgotten how to prioritize her own needs and safety. This realization had led to what her book club friends called Helen's Renaissance period. She'd started taking yoga classes specifically designed for seniors, not just for the physical benefits, but for the mental discipline it required. The instructor, a woman in her 70s who moved with surprising grace, had emphasized the importance of staying connected to your body and recognizing when something wasn't right. Our bodies are constantly communicating with us, she'd said during one particularly challenging session. The key is learning to listen without panic, to respond with wisdom rather than fear. Helen had practiced this philosophy through minor health scares: a suspicious mole that turned out to be benign, chest pains that were diagnosed as acid reflux, dizzy spells that were linked to medication side effects. Each experience had built her confidence in navigating the healthcare system as a single senior, but she'd never imagined facing a true emergency completely alone. The emergency preparedness workshop she'd attended had covered the basics: keeping important phone numbers accessible, having a list of medications handy, knowing the signs of common medical emergencies. But the instructor had been a young paramedic who'd never addressed the unique challenges of being over 60 and isolated when crisis strikes. Helen thought about the support network she'd carefully cultivated over the past few years. There was Margaret from book club, who checked in every few days. Her daughter called every Sunday without fail. Her son texted randomly but consistently. The mail carrier, Tony, had become a friendly face who noticed when things seemed off. Even Mrs. Patterson next door, despite being away, had left her contact information and asked Helen to call if anything seemed wrong. But none of these people were here now, in this moment when her body was failing and time was running out. Helen realized that all the emotional resilience and community connections in the world meant nothing if she couldn't take the first crucial step of getting help. The weight of her solitude pressed down on her like a physical force. But within that pressure, she found something unexpected, a clarity born from years of quiet strength and self-reliance. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. When you're alone, you're never truly alone if you remember everything you've learned. Just as Helen began to focus on reaching the phone, she heard the distinct sound of a key turning in her front door. Her heart jumped, not from the stroke symptoms, but from genuine surprise. Only 3 people had keys to her house: her daughter, her son, and Robert's brother David, who lived 2 states away and hadn't visited in over a year. "Aunt Helen, I hope you don't mind me dropping by unannounced," called a familiar voice that made her breath catch. It was David, but something was different about his tone, softer, more tentative than she remembered. "I was driving through town and I thought maybe we could finally talk." Helen tried to call out, but her voice came out as an unintelligible mumble. She heard David's footsteps approaching the kitchen, and within seconds, he appeared in the doorway. At 72, David still carried himself with the same quiet strength that had reminded her so much of Robert, but his face showed the weathering of recent struggles. "Helen, what happened here?" he asked, taking in the broken mug and her obvious distress. Then his expression shifted to alarm as he noticed her drooping face and the way she was leaning against the counter. "Are you having a stroke?" She managed a small nod, grateful that someone finally understood. David immediately pulled out his phone and dialed 911, his voice calm and clear as he provided the address and described her symptoms. Helen felt a wave of relief wash over her, not just because help was coming, but because David was here after all this time. Their relationship had been complicated since Robert's death. David had been executor of his brother's estate, and disagreements over financial decisions had created a rift that neither of them had known how to bridge. Helen had felt abandoned when David stopped calling, stopped visiting, stopped being the brother-in-law who had once been like family. She'd assumed he blamed her for something, though she was never sure what. As they waited for the ambulance, David knelt beside her, his hand steady on her shoulder. "I'm so sorry, Helen," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been wanting to come see you for months, but I didn't know how to apologize for pulling away. After Robert died, I couldn't handle being around the house, around the memories. It wasn't about you. It was about me being a coward." Helen wanted to tell him that she understood, that grief makes people do strange things, that she'd missed him too. Instead, she squeezed his hand with her good one, hoping he'd understand the gesture. This rediscovery after 60 felt like a miracle wrapped in a medical emergency. "I came today because I've been going to therapy," David continued, his words coming faster now. learning about how I handle loss, how I've spent years running from difficult emotions. My therapist suggested I make amends with people I've hurt, and you were at the top of my list. I never imagined I'd walk into this situation, but maybe it's exactly where I was supposed to be. The sound of sirens grew louder, and Helen realized that what could have been the worst day of her life was becoming something else entirely, a chance for healing family bonds that she'd thought were permanently broken. Sometimes new beginnings arrive in the most unexpected ways, wrapped in crisis and requiring the kind of courage that only comes with age and experience. David's presence meant she wouldn't face this alone, but more importantly, it meant that some chapters of her life weren't finished yet. The paramedics arrived within minutes, their efficient movements filling Helen's kitchen with purposeful energy. As they checked her vital signs and prepared her for transport, David stayed close, answering questions about her medical history and medications with surprising accuracy. Helen realized he'd been paying attention all those years, even when their relationship felt strained. "You're going to be fine," the lead paramedic assured her as they loaded her onto the stretcher. "You got help quickly, and that makes all the difference." Helen caught David's eye and saw something she hadn't seen in years. The protective concern of family, the kind of love that transcends disagreements and hurt feelings. During the ambulance ride, David held her hand and talked softly about memories they'd shared. He told her about Robert's favorite fishing spot, about the time all three of them had gotten lost driving to a family reunion and ended up laughing until their sides hurt. These stories weren't just conversation. They were David's way of saying that their shared history mattered more than their recent silence. At the hospital, as doctors administered the clot-busting medication that would minimize the stroke's impact, Helen experienced a moment of profound clarity. This life's turning point after 60 wasn't just about surviving a medical emergency. It was about recognizing that healing comes in many forms. The physical healing happening in her brain was paralleled by the emotional healing happening in her heart. The next few hours passed in a blur of medical procedures and tests, but David never left her side. When a doctor confirmed that they'd caught the stroke early enough to prevent major damage, Helen felt tears of relief roll down her cheeks. But the deeper tears came when David leaned close and whispered, "I'm sorry I wasn't there for you after Robert died. I'm sorry I let my own grief make me selfish." Helen found her voice returning gradually, and the first words she managed were, "I forgave you before you even apologized." The wisdom with age had taught her that holding on to hurt only weighs you down, and life is too precious to waste on grudges. David's eyes filled with tears as he understood that their relationship had been healing even during their time apart. As evening approached and Helen's condition stabilized, she realized that the stroke had given her something unexpected, not just David's return, but a deeper understanding of what truly mattered. The broken mug in her kitchen had been replaced by a repaired relationship. The fear of facing crisis alone had been transformed into gratitude for the people who show up when you need them most. The doctors explained that her quick thinking in recognizing the stroke symptoms, combined with David's immediate response, had saved her from significant disability. But Helen knew the real miracle wasn't just medical. It was a reminder that life, after 60, could still hold surprises, that emotional closure could arrive wrapped in crisis, and that sometimes the people we think we've lost are simply waiting for the right moment to come home. David squeezed her hand as she drifted off to sleep that night, and Helen realized that her greatest fear, being alone during a medical emergency, had actually led to her greatest gift, the return of family she thought she'd lost forever. Some strokes take things away, but this one had given her something back. 3 months later, Helen stood in her kitchen again, this time with David by her side as they prepared lunch together. The new coffee mug, a simple white one from the local diner, sat safely in the dish drainer, a quiet reminder of how much had changed. Her recovery had been remarkable, with only minor lingering effects that barely impacted her daily life. But the real transformation went far deeper than physical healing. "I never thought I'd say this," Helen told David as they worked side by side, "but I'm grateful for what happened that day." David paused in his chopping to look at her, understanding passing between them. They'd had many conversations over the past months about how crisis can sometimes be life's way of redirecting us toward what we really need. The experience had taught Helen that senior resilience isn't just about maintaining independence. It's about knowing when to accept help and recognizing that vulnerability can be a doorway to deeper connection. She'd spent so many years after Robert's death, proving she could handle everything alone, that she'd forgotten the strength that comes from letting others care for you. David had moved closer, renting a small apartment just 20 minutes away. Their weekly dinners had become a cherished tradition, filled with stories about Robert, childhood memories, and plans for the future. Helen discovered that healing family bonds doesn't erase the past. It transforms it into something that can nurture rather than wound. The stroke had also changed how Helen approached her daily life. She'd installed a medical alert system, not out of fear, but out of wisdom. She'd joined a stroke support group where she shared her story and learned from others who'd walked similar paths. Most importantly, she'd stopped apologizing for needing help or asking for what she needed. "You know what I learned?" Helen said, stirring the soup they'd made together. "I spent so much time preparing for emergencies that I forgot to prepare for joy. I was so focused on being strong that I forgot being open to love is also a form of strength." David smiled, the same smile that had reminded her so much of Robert. "Aunt Helen, you taught me something too. I learned that running from grief doesn't make it go away. It just makes you miss out on everything else. Coming back to you helped me come back to myself." These timeless lessons hadn't come easily, but they'd come at exactly the right moment. Helen often thought about other seniors who might be facing their own challenges alone, and she'd started volunteering with a program that checked on elderly neighbors. Her story had become a bridge to help others understand that asking for help isn't giving up independence. It's choosing to stay connected to the world around you. Life's quiet victories, Helen had learned, often arrive disguised as our worst fears. The broken mug had led to a rebuilt relationship. The moment of greatest vulnerability had become a source of lasting strength. The day she thought might be her last had actually been the beginning of a new chapter filled with deeper connections and clearer priorities. Standing in her kitchen now, surrounded by the sounds and smells of a shared meal, Helen understood that growing older doesn't mean growing smaller. Sometimes it means growing wiser, braver, and more open to the unexpected gifts that life continues to offer, even when we think we know how our story ends.